So as usual, I'll continue to take material from different reports and papers as I find relevant for this chapter on adaptation in the health sector. Some reports are older, almost a decade, but the basic principles don't really change, of course, and I'll always add things if I find them newer reports that are worthy of reporting, and I'll most likely include them in the new findings section which I have after each course. So this report is on the WHO guidance to protect health from climate change through health adaptation planning. There is a similar report from UNDP that's a bit short, so we'll include those as well. This particular report has various chapters. So you have overview of the National Adaptation Plan, which we discussed elsewhere. So the process and purpose of the guidance, health within the NAP process, the HNAP. So this is the Health Adaptation Plan, adaptation processes, as we'll see. Principles of the National Health Adaptation Process, key concepts in health adaptation to climate change. So these are useful to include here. And fifth one, the Health Adaptation Process, elements and steps, which has these few steps that we will look at. I always start the podcast and then I start forgetting the acronyms, so I'll read off some of these so that when we come up on them you can always try to remember yourself. Well, it's tricky because I may have multiple podcasts, so you have to go back, but anyway, I'll also try to mention them in each podcast. So we have Country Coordination Committee, CCC, COP, everybody knows, Conference of the Parties, Green Climate Fund, you know about that, I'm sure. Global Framework for Climate Services is something that's come up in the World Climate Research Program and is somewhat of a repackaging of El Nino forecast, but new additions in terms of S2S, the subseasonal to seasonal forecast. I have a whole course on that you can look up. So here is HNAP, Health National Adaptation Process, which was mentioned here. So NAP is National Adaptation Plan, whereas HNAP is Health National Adaptation Process. Least developed countries export group, least developed countries fund, monitoring and evaluation, which has come up many times, National Adaptation Plan that we mentioned, National Adaptation Program of Action, NAPA, United Nations Development Program. We have all heard of United Nations Environmental Program, also is something familiar to us. UNFCCC, I'm always unsure about how many C's I'm saying. United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which has come up a lot in the discussions of IPCC because IPCC sits under the UNFCCC. Vulnerability and adaptation we looked at before in the food security as well. Vector-borne diseases and World Health Organization, which is the author of this report. So let's start this with the overview of the National Adaptation Plan process and purpose of the guidance. Sustainable development became a formal global process in 1992 when the three Rio Conventions on biodiversity, climate change and desertification were adopted at the Earth Summit. The 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and its Kyoto Protocol, adopted in 1997, refer to the legal frameworks that maintain the international climate change process and agenda. We have since the Paris Agreement replacing the Kyoto, or following Kyoto, of course. Both legal instruments are serviced by the Climate Change Secretariat, or UNFCCC Secretariat. The Secretariat is accountable to the Conference of the Parties, which happens every year. We're coming up on COP28 in Egypt, but the war in Israel with Gaza may make this a bit challenging. Let's see how it evolves. So the Secretariat is accountable to the Conference of Parties to the Convention, which meets annually to negotiate and further discuss the international climate change agenda and related commitments from countries. Article 7 and 9 of the UNFCCC set the framework for international organizations to cooperate and contribute technically in their respective areas of work to the COP and to its subsidiary bodies for scientific and technological advice. Okay, A few points: having the UNFCCC in general and the National Adaptation Plan process in particular as a framework, the present guidance aims to ensure that the health sector works with partners in the environment and other related communities and follows a systematic process to engage in the overall NAP process at the national level, identify national strategic goals for building health resilience to climate change if countries have not done so through, for example, a national health adaptation strategy, develop a national plan with the prioritized activities to achieve these goals within a specific time period and given available resources. Okay, with that we come to the second step of the WHO guidance, health within the NAP process, the health adaptation process. What was it? Health National? See, I keep forgetting, that's why. Health National Adaptation Process. This guidance document is designed to ensure that the process of iteratively managing the health risks of climate change is integrated into the overall NAP process, and including through assessing risks, identifying, prioritizing and implementing adaptation options, and monitoring and evaluating the adaptation process. Supported by the LEG, the Large Export Group. What is that? Low That's a problem, isn't it? Least Developed Countries Export Group. There we go. The UNFCCC and the other relevant partners, for example, in UNDP and UNEP, WHO, development agencies and non-governmental organizations. So using all these relevant partners, countries can use the NAP process to start planning their mid and long-term priorities to build resilience to climate change across all sectors. But here we are, of course, in the context of health. Thirdly, principles of the National Health Adaptation Process. The HNAP Health National Adaptation Process so HNAP process allows the principles stated in the least developed countries export group guidance for the overall NAP process. These include: the NAP is a country-driven process owned by the countries, so each one comes up with a national adaptation plan, submits it. In the previous podcast we have looked at the progress made, countries which have submitted a plan, countries which are planning, countries which have made progress, and so on. Ensuring that health adaptation planning is based on the best available evidence is part of this NAP process, HNAP. Any adaptation plan should aim at strengthening the development and availability of evidence, building the data, and reducing knowledge gaps and inform relevant policies. Building on existing national efforts towards health adaptation to climate change, including assessments and development and implementation of policies and programs at local to national levels. These can only work at local and national levels. Global mean temperatures, global sea level rise, etc. are not that useful when it comes to how they cascade into health impacts and how health impacts have to be dealt with at local scales. Integrating health adaptation to climate change into national health planning strategies, processes and monitoring systems. This is part of the adaptation process. Providing for a flexible and context-specific approach to health adaptation to climate change, national circumstances and available information and experience on health and climate change will determine the scope, institutional arrangements and resources required to properly implement the health component of the national adaptation plan. So national adaptation plan has to have sectoral plans, obviously, for health, infrastructure, energy, water, agriculture, and so on. So health has to be very much part of it. A few more points from this step 3 of principles of national health adaptation process. Maximizing synergies across sectors, mainly across those that determine health, such as food, water, energy, and housing sectors. This calls for developing relevant health indicators within the adaptation monitoring systems in these sectors, ensuring that health considerations are integrated into their adaptation planning to avoid maladaptation. You don't want to do adaptation in one sector, like let's say water sanitation or energy, air quality or housing in the wrong places, and in the path of persistent extremes, for example, and have maladaptation for health. Okay, ensuring that health adaptation plan feeds into and coordinates with the overall national adaptation plan, piloting approaches that promote an iterative process for health adaptation to climate change, producing time-bound plans. So monitoring, evaluation, verification, and reporting requires these timelines, right? Promoting inter-country collaboration and harmonizing adaptation approaches at sub-regional levels. This is especially true for a region like the Indian subcontinent. So you have highly vulnerable, health vulnerable countries like Pakistan, Nepal, India, Bangladesh, Burma, Bhutan, and so on, all clustered together in the monsoon regimes and other seasonal factors. And obviously, infectious diseases and so on do not care about international boundaries, just like climate change. And just like climate change, health outcomes are not gender neutral, so women and children tend to be affected much more. So finally here, key concepts in health adaptation to climate change. We'll come back and take a break of this podcast in the next section, I think, somewhere here. I'll do the right thing to keep it short enough and not make it too long. Key concepts in health adaptation to climate change. Public health has long history in planning, in designing, implementing and monitoring and evaluating strategies, policies and programs to manage the risks of climate relevant health outcomes. This process, when applied to climate change, is termed adaptation by the climate community. The degree to which programs will need to be augmented will depend on factors such as the current burden of climate-sensitive health outcomes. The focus of vulnerability and adaptation assessments is often on outcomes that cause the largest health burdens now. Adaptation will help populations prepare for changes that could increase the incidence, seasonality, or geographic range of climate-relevant health outcomes, or that make their control more difficult. So with warming, you have vectors expanding their domains, latitude band. You have tropical diseases moving northward and southward towards the poles, and so on and so forth. The effectiveness of current interventions to manage the health risks of climate variability and change. Few current programs and measures are as effective as desired. Understanding the extent to which current public health and healthcare policies and programs are effective and the reasons for limits to effectiveness is a first step in understanding what modifications are needed to address the risks of a changing climate. Projections of where, when, and how health burdens could be modified in response to changes in the mean and vulnerability of climate. Okay. Other important concepts are adaptive capacity and resilience. Adaptive capacity is the combination of strengths, attributes, and resources available to an individual, community, society, or organization that can be used to prepare for and undertake actions to reduce adverse impacts, moderate harm, or exploit beneficial opportunities. Okay, adaptive capacity and resilience in the health sector must be parallel to all the other sectors as well. Adaptive capacity describes the potential to take proactive action to prepare for the health risks of climate change. Resilience is the ability of a system and its component parts to anticipate, absorb, accommodate, and or recover from the effects of hazardous events in a timely and efficient manner. So more resilient the system, more quickly you recover from shocks. Okay. Let's read one more. The health adaptation process, elements and steps. It is important for the health adaptation process to be consistent with and easily linked to the NAP process. The technical guidelines developed by the Least Developed Countries Export Group, LEG, were prepared to support least developed and developing countries in planning their national adaptation policies and programs. The guidelines include 4 elements, each with several steps. Other low and middle income countries are using guidelines in their national adaptation process. We looked at IMF tools and so on to do the cost benefit analysis and to guide countries on evaluating the prioritization, public finance management and so on in the adaptation. Here we are looking at health adaptation, where again help is needed for least developed and developing countries or low income countries to develop their NAPs and integrate health resilience into them. The elements of the process are, in terms of health adaptation, lay the groundwork, preparatory elements, implementation strategies, and report, monitor, and review. These are written in many ways. It's MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification, or report, monitor, and review, but they are all the same thing in terms of setting metrics and timelines and making sure progress is being made. These are broadly related to the phases of a project cycle, like identification, formulation, implementation, and monitoring, and evaluation. Brief guidance for each element and steps is provided, along with links to additional materials that expand on the methods and tools available to achieve each step. Okay, so there are A, B, C, D that we looked at before, so we'll maybe come back and look at those in the next podcast. But remember that we are in the health adaptation process looking at elements and steps, which will continue in the next podcast. This is already 16 minutes or longer, so let's leave this here, okay?